I sincerely doubt that there's anyone out there who doesn't know what that sound is. But okay, benefit of the doubt, I'll do you one better. Now I'm positive that everyone knows what that is. Godzilla, or Gojira to hipsters, purists, or the Japanese. No matter what you call him, this giant monster has stomped his way from rather humble beginnings into being one of the most celebrated, iconic, and recognizable creatures, or hell, just characters in science fiction. But why is that exactly? What separates Godzilla from, say, Reptilicus, or Guanji, or even Gamera? What's helped him last for more than half a century and still remain both entertaining to mass audiences and culturally relevant among genre fans and film analysts? The answer is actually simple enough. It's thanks to his ability to not only brutally symbolize some very real-world dangers, but even more so his ability to adapt along with society. There have been many versions of Godzilla over the years, from silly rubber suits bouncing on trampolines in the 60s to late 90s Roland Emmerich CGI puppets. Across his 63-year lifespan, Godzilla has been retooled and reworked as many times as any comic book hero. But 3 versions of him stand apart and exemplify why he's such an important icon. The 1954 original Gojira, Gareth Edwards' Americanized Legendary Pictures version from 2014 simply titled Godzilla, and the most recent screen adaptation, at least at the time of this recording, Toho's own return to form, Shin Godzilla. Each of them are visually spectacular mammoth creatures and carry with them a majesty and fear that makes you want to take them seriously, unlike the other versions. And each are emblematic of slightly different dangers or issues we might face in our world. The simplest way to get down to the juicy minutiae of all that symbolism is to first just crash through a quick synopsis of all 3 plots as they stand. Gojira and Shin Godzilla both open with disasters at sea, while Godzilla 2014 opens, after an amazing credit sequence, in the Philippines and moves quickly to a disaster at a nuclear plant. All 3 of these tragedies get the plots going and are perpetuated by a monster menace. While Gojira and Shin follow the same basic plots of the titular monster coming from the sea to wreak havoc on Japan, leaving humanity scrambling to craft a means to destroy him, 2014 goes a slightly different route and is the only one of these 3 films to feature a monster other than Godzilla himself. There are still differences between the oldest and the newest though, with the original making a stop off on Odo Island for the monster's first appearance, while Shin never leaves Japan, other than a brief cutaway to an American office. Godzilla 2014 follows a family affected by the aforementioned plant tragedy through a web of circumstances that ultimately leads to an epic showdown between Godzilla and the parasitic Muto monsters in San Francisco. Our lead does his part to stop an ill-fated nuclear detonation, and Godzilla kills the monster villains. The other 2 wrap up in similar ways on paper, but not so much in practice. With their armies spent and running out of ideas, the world of the original film turns to the war-scarred, morally torn Dr. Serizawa to use his accidentally created superweapon, the Oxygen Destroyer, to kill the beast. Shin Godzilla has less of a moral quandary and more of a race against time, in that the government folks just put their heads together and create a biological blood coagulant to force-feed the monster before more extreme nuclear measures are forced upon them by the world at large. Serizawa in the 54 film does come through and destroys the monster, but on an ultimately somber note, as he doesn't think humanity is mature or trustworthy enough for his creation. So he burns his notes and dies with Godzilla in the sea. Now that the stories are all squared away, time to get down to business. What exactly do each of these different incarnations embody? As for Gojira, it's pretty well documented and known that he was and is a vengeful stand-in for nuclear proliferation. Even from the opening moments of the film with the number 5 life reservoir and horrifying flashes of deadly light denoting the Lucky Dragon number 5 nuclear tragedy. In fact, how about some bonus set dressing symbolism found in the elements of the film that aren't the monster? Number 1. The horror and conflict of the film starts off with 2 flashes several days apart from one another that obviously evoke the 2 nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Number 2. The monster's implied presence on Odo Island irradiates the water and food supply enough to affect the natives. Number 3. The post-attack hospital scenes echo obvious wartime and post-detonation triages in Japan. It's also worth noting that on top of the clear and ever-present metaphor for the dangers of nuclear energy that he is in this film, Godzilla also stands in for something a tad bit less orthodox. Godzilla's harsh, scaly hide and the hellish scarring that those suffering from radiation burns or poisoning had to endure bear a discomforting similarity. This and his slightly awkward mobility, demonstrated by him swatting blindly at attacking fighter planes, paint the monster as slightly sympathetic, at least subconsciously. He too can be seen as just another victim of the ravages of nuclear power, lashing out like a traumatized, blinded victim of the bombings. Aside from that, the general representative elements of this film's monster, as I said, are pretty front and center, and there's a half-century of documentation about it, so forgive me for glancing over certain elements. I'd rather not tread the water where a million other analysts have and repeat what they've said, and simply just push on to the other two films with all of this information as holy writ. Godzilla 2014's deeper meanings come off as a bit more grounded in modern-day sensibilities, for obvious reasons. While the disarmament of nuclear weapons, our lead character is an EOD soldier after all, as well as the issues of atomic waste storage are brought up front and center, it's brief. And fairly early on, the film somewhat dismisses this fear entirely, showing that the contaminated zone set up early in the film is actually sterile and safe. So atomic energy falls away from the centerfold in favor of the major topic that the film wants you to think about: nature and natural disasters. Just look at some of this imagery. Hurricane Katrina, Pacific earthquakes, and tropical storms all make an appearance. The look of the destruction in the film have been taken right from post-millennial headlines and painstakingly recreated on screen to elicit some familiar awe from us, the audience. And if the destruction they cause is emblematic of natural disasters, then the monsters themselves show us a darker and lighter side of nature itself. The Mutos, the hostile, perhaps vengeful if not downright evil side, driven to the surface by humanity's careless meddlings or dangerous ways, while Godzilla acts more as a guardian, though not fully explicitly. He does fight our enemies, but he doesn't fight them for us. And even though he doesn't go out of his way to kill anyone or destroy anything at any point on screen, his sheer size and power undeniably do just that, much the same way that a typhoon would, obviously with no forethought to the consequences. This film, much like the original, paints a picture where humanity can do virtually nothing to stop a giant monster. But instead of human ingenuity ultimately, although dangerously, crafting our salvation, Godzilla 2014 shows a world where we humans are essentially helpless spectators, looking in on a violent, primordial, natural world that we've wronged enough to warrant punishment from. Shin Godzilla is undeniably the most complex and least in-your-face about what it's trying to say, which makes sense as the original film wasn't seen as so obvious back when it came out. People were focused more on the spectacle than the symbolism. Same can be said largely for this film. It's a fresh, new take on the story while being familiar on paper and to the uninitiated. Before diving right into what I think the focus of Shin Godzilla is, there's another deeply modern element the film plays with, and that's politics. I know that that's a dirty word lately, please bear with me. Every single move the creature makes throughout the film, the humans have some kind of committee meeting or delegation or debate or vote or blah 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 about before deciding how to move forward. It'd really be kind of tedious if it wasn't so pointed. This choice on the part of the screenwriter was obviously meant to lash out at Japanese politics and processes, to criticize how they respond to potential catastrophes. If not for the dire straits illustrated in the film, it could have come off as a darkly comedic satire, and it's a hell of a cynical middle finger from the people to those in power, without painting the government characters as fully inept or ridiculous. Also, unlike the other two films, Shin Godzilla doesn't ignore how the rest of the world responds to a potentially apocalyptic monster attack. There's a lot of time dedicated to this, including a subplot in which the UN, mostly the US, basically give Japan an ultimatum to evacuate the area around Godzilla before they nuke him in the middle of a civilian city. Harsh. The film respects how the situation might be handled if it happened in our world right now. But what about the monster himself? Does this version mirror classic fears of nuclear annihilation, or is it closer to Edward's natural disaster-zilla? Well, honestly, a little of both, but neither are the focus. There's still a healthy dose, no pun intended, of nuclear warnings in the images of gas masks and computerized radiation tracking after Godzilla's beam attacks, but there's also an intelligent use of more modern visual parallels to things like earthquakes, hurricanes, and the Fukushima nuclear emergency from a few years back. It really does meet in the middle on that one. Still, if you asked me what Shin Godzilla itself or himself truly embodies in this film, I'd, without hesitation, say life, or evolution. Right from the jump, we see the waters of Tokyo Bay swirling in a chaotic primordial ooze which pretty quickly gives birth to a very simple worm-like life form. Very similar, perhaps, to something a fledgling Earth could have seen trying to crawl out of its hot seas long ago. Yes, I know, the worm is obviously the tadpole Godzilla's tail, but stay with me. After that, the unformed, nascent, almost embryonic form of Godzilla scuttles through the shallows, not quite ready or able to come fully onto the land. Soon enough, though, it wiggles its way out, still obviously maladapted to such an environment, as it's not only awkward and clumsy, but leaking. Well, more likely venting, as we later learn that its rapid evolution produces insane amounts of heat. Before we know it, the thing does its best to stand erect, struggling but eventually shifting how its body is formed to accomplish this. What's interesting to note here, and what gives even more credence to this theory, is that right here is the first time the monster seems fully aware of both its environment and humanity. Before this, it just kind of squirmed around, not even seeming to have functioning vision. But here, it looks around, takes in the landscape, sees the military choppers, and roars at them before retreating. Much like perhaps how an early version of Erect Man saw his landscape anew for the first time when he stood up. When he returns, though, he's fully formed and more recognizable as Godzilla, standing as the tallest screen incarnation and seeming even more aware of his surroundings. Skipping a lot for the sake of keeping to the evolutionary metaphor right now, by the end of the film we see him frozen solid with the blood coagulant the humans injected him with, but we see the tip of his tail still pointed towards the sky. But it's less than normal. It seems that in one final act of forced evolution to try and survive what was being done to it, Godzilla saw that its best chance of survival was to proliferate, to expand to multiple smaller organisms, giving it a higher chance of escape. This haunting image of these still-life humanoids evokes a sort of uncanny valley horror in us, looking perhaps like those in Pompeii buried in ash as they fled the city. Shin Godzilla demonstrates a life cycle throughout the film that's analogous, albeit simply, of how we understand life to have evolved from single-celled aquatic organisms to thinking hominids today. Another prism to look at this through hides right in the name, Shin. Among other translations, this word literally means God. Depending on how you want to take that, there is context in dialogue both for Godzilla as a biologically perfect being and as a literal incarnation of God. Honestly though, putting it simply and mythologically, what else creates life but a god? He demonstrates certain characteristics traditionally associated with that of a vengeful deity as well. Even though his mere existence in our world causes plenty of havoc and death, the first time Godzilla openly, actively retaliates against the humans is after they actually hurt him. You slight God, God punishes you. He sends you right to hell. And you can't tell me that this city doesn't look like hell when he's done with it. Although it's not outwardly touched on, there's a brief scene in the film where you can see pro-Godzilla protesters. Every god needs devout followers, after all. This is one of the very few films in the series, I'm talking maybe less than 3 total, where they call him both Godzilla and Gojira. This too gives some credence to the god theory, acting almost as differing translations or interpretations of biblical texts. The music too subliminally drives home as parallel, sounding like a gothic church choir belting out some dark, reverent hymn to assuage the wrath of something they don't fully understand. Even our lead character, a level-headed, hard-working man at the Japanese political machine, is in silenced awe upon first seeing him with his own eyes. So, is Shin Godzilla a metaphor for evolution, or a vengeful god? Why not both? Science and religion. Each of these schools of thought explain the meaning behind Shin Godzilla just as well, and even complement each other, if you think about it. Okay. The dangers of nuclear energy, the awe and power of nature itself, and evolution and/or God personified. That's some heavy shit. A lot more than just some rubber suits or computer puppets punching buildings apart when you pull back the layers. And that's just the thing. Godzilla has endured over the past half-century for all of these deep, meaningful reasons and the popcorny ones. He's the model for every good monster villain or hero that's come along since. Whether something tries to emulate the sheer dumb fun factor, or act as a dark, grim avatar for problems we or our world face, everything in that spectrum owes something to Godzilla. If any one element had been missing, Godzilla as a franchise might have flopped, or fallen by the wayside as another 50s B-movie, or just another crappy American retelling of a foreign film property. It's hard enough to become a cultural icon in one nation, let alone worldwide. Now add on top of that the fact that he's a building-sized lizard thing, and you can see what a marvel that success really was and still is. After all, how many monsters have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame? Just one so far as I know. Here's to 63 years of Godzilla and many more ahead.